Now the global fascism has finally taken over. Multiple countries in the world are under fascist rule right now. Examples are the United States of America, India, Japan, South Korea. I was about to say Syria, but they recently been overthrown, so it's gonna be an Islamic state, or at least a very moderate quote unquote one. Turkey, Argentina, El Salvador, I already mentioned India, and countries that are not completely controlled, but the second largest party or the largest party of their respective parliaments are under fascist dominance, like France, Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Germany, etc., etc. The only way to defeat this is by the power of pacifism, and people think that it's not viable. But in reality, scientific study has shown that pacifist approach is more effective than any violent approach. Good analysis by a scholar called George Leakey. Can nonviolent struggle defeat a dictatorship? This database empathetically says yes. The Global Nonviolent Action Database details some 40 cases of mass movements overcoming tyrants through strategic nonviolent campaigns. With Donald Trump set to take office after a fear-mongering campaign that reignites concern about his desire to become a dictator, a reasonable question comes up. Can nonviolent struggle defeat a tyrant? There are numerous great resources that answer this question, but the one that's been on my mind lately is the Global Nonviolent Action Database, or the GNAD, built by the Peace Studies Department at Swarthmore College, freely accessible to the public. This database, which launched under George Lackey's direction in 2011, contained over 1,400 cases of nonviolent struggle from over 100 countries, with more cases continuing to be added by students and researchers. At quick glance, the database detailed that at least 40 cases of dictators who were overthrown by a use of nonviolent struggle, dating back to 1920. These cases, which include some of the largest nations in the world, spanning Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, contradict the widespread assumption that a dictator can only be overcome by violence. What's more, in each of these cases, the dictators had the desire to stay and possess violent means for defense. Ultimately, though, they just wouldn't overcome the power of mass non-violent struggle. In a number of countries, the dictator had been embedded for years. That at the time they were pushed out. Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, for example, had ruled for over 29 years. In the 1990s, citizens usually whispered his name for fear of reprisal. Mubarak legalized a state of emergency, which meant censorship, expand police power, and limit on the news media. Later, he loosened his rules, putting only 10 times as many police as the number of protesters at each demonstration. The case study described how Egyptians grew their democracy movement despite repression and finally won in 2011. However, gaining a measure of freedom doesn't guarantee keeping it, as Egypt has shown in years since. Continued vigilance is indeed as its proactive campaigning to deepen the degree of freedom won. Some countries repeat the feat of nonviolent deposit a ruler. In Chile, the people nonviolently threw out a fascist dictator in 1931 and then deposed a new dictator in 1988, Augusto Pinochet. South Koreans also did twice, once in 1960 and again in 1987. They also just stopped their current president from seizing dictatorial power, but that's not yet in the database. In each case, people had to act without knowing what the reprisal would be. Another example would be India in 2021 to 2022, when they did the largest protest in human history, a farmer protest that was 300 million people, or 3.3% of India's population, that successfully blocked anti-farmer laws. Or in Sri Lanka in 2024, that successfully kicked out the dictator through non-violent means, liberating the country. East Germany's peaceful revolution, when East Germany began their revolution against the German Democratic Republic in 1988. They knew that the dictatorship of 43 years was backed by the Soviet Union, which staged a deadly invasion. They nevertheless asked for freedom, which they gained and kept. Researcher Hannah King tells us that East Germany began their successful campaign in January 1988 by taking a traditional annual memorial march and turning it into a full-scale demonstration for human rights and democracy. They follow up by taking advantage of a weekly prayer for peace at a church in Lisbon to organize rallies and protests. Lutheran pastors helped protect the organizer from retaliation, and groups in other cities began to stage their own Monday night demonstrations. I am sorry about that. The few hundred initial protesters we quickly became 70,000, then 120,000, then 320,000, all participating in the weekly demonstrations. Organizers had published a pamphlet outlining their vision for a united German democracy and turned it into a petition. Prisoners of conscience began hunger strikes in solidarity. By November 1988, a million people gathered in Berlin, chanting, singing, and waving banners calling for the dictatorship to end. The government, hoping to ease the pressure, announced the opening of the border to West Germany. Citizens took sledgehammer to the hated Berlin Wall and broke it down. Political officials resigned to protest the continued rigidity of the ruling party, and the party itself disintegrated. By the March 1990, it been over 2 years after the campaign was launched, the first multi-party democracy election was held. Students led the way in Pakistan. It was a university student rather than a religious current who launched the 1968 to 1969 uprising that forced Ayub Khan out of office after his decade as a dictator. Case researcher Eileen Eisberg tells us that the campaign later required multiple sectors of society to join together to achieve critical mass, especially workers. It was the students, though, who took the initiative and the initial risks. In 1968, they declared that the government declaration of a decade of development was fraud and protested nonviolently in major cities. They sang and marched with their own song called the Decade of Sadness. The people opened fire on one of the demonstrations, killing several students. In reaction, the movement expanded in numbers and demands. Boycotts grew, with masses of people refusing to pay the bus and rally fares at the government-run transportation system. The industrial workers joined the movement and practiced circumvent factories and mills. An escalation of government repression followed, including more killings. As the campaign expanded from urban to rural parts of Pakistan, the movement's son and political feeder thrived. Khan responded with more violence, which intensified the determination among a critical mass of Pakistanis that it was a time for him to go. After a month of growing direct action met by repressive violence, the army decided its own reputation was being disregarded by their orders for the president and demanded their resignation. He compiled an election was scheduled in 1970, but first since Pakistani independence in 1947. So why use nonviolent struggle? The campaigns in East Germany and Pakistan are typical of all 40 cases in the lack of pacifist ideology, although same individual actions in the movement had that foundation. What the case two seem to have in common is that the organizers saw the strategic value of nonviolent action. They likely use violent repression to commit to nonviolence would they rally the mass at their side. The best example is the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet rule, where virtually every country under the Soviet bloc, with the exception of Romania, have achieved independence by nonviolence. The same thing for to apartheid South Africa. The same thing happened in India as well. And when Hitler tried to do his first coup, the Pau Putsch in 1921, he was defeated by nonviolent resistance. That encouraged me that hardly the time the US during Trump's regime to convert enough people to an ideological commitment to nonviolence, but there is time to persuade people of the strategic value of nonviolent discipline. It's striking that in many cases I look at, the movement avoid merely symbolic marches and rallies that focus on tactics that impose a cause of the regime. As Donald Trump wrestled to bring the armed forces under his control, for example, I can imagine picketing army recruiting officers who say don't join a dictator's army. Another important takeaway, occasional actions that supply protest a particular policy or egregious action are enough. They may relieve an individual conscience for a moment, but ultimately episodic action, even large ones, don't assert enough power. Over and over, the global nonviolent action database showed that positive results come from a series of escalated connected actions called a campaign, the importance of which is also outlined in George Lackey's book, How We Win. As research seminar students, as some more continue to wade through history, finding new cases that are digging up the details of struggle to go beyond democracy. The 1,400 already published cases include campaign for further environmental justice, racial and economic justice, and more that are sourced for tactical ideas and strategy consideration, encouraging us to remember that even long-established dictatorships have been stopped by the power of nonviolent action. And remember, this is not a modern phenomenon. We see examples throughout history. For example, the Mongol conquest, actually, there are examples of nonviolent resistance where people disrupt trade unions, if they were not trade unions, trade, if they train routes to disrupt merchants, is an example. Or during the Atlantic and Islamic slave trades, where the slave refused to work or escape or they use the communication to disrupt the trading process, etc., and etc. Same can go to the genocide against the indigenous population of the Americas, where certain native indigenous population tribes use nonviolent resistance. Pope is one example who became a pacifist prophet. Este, in many cases like these, it is possible to achieve nonviolent resistance. It's only time to act.